Is Vladimir Putin right about the US dollar? On Friday, Tucker Carlson interviewed Vladimir Putin. In a 2-hour-long interview, they discussed a lot of different things, but I was especially interested in what Putin had to say about the outlook for the US dollar. Check out Putin's answer when Tucker Carlson asked Putin what he thinks about the role of the US dollar.
Currency, how have sanctions, do you think, changed the dollar's place in the world?
You know, to use the dollar as a tool of foreign policy struggle is one of the biggest strategic mistakes made by the US political leadership. The dollar is the cornerstone of the United States power, but they won't stop printing. What does the debt of $33 trillion tell us about?
Now, despite what you might say about Putin, I think he has a really good point when he says that the US has made a big mistake in weaponizing the US dollar for international policy. Now, first of all, what does this mean exactly, weaponizing the US dollar? To understand this, we have to first of all understand that the US dollar is the global reserve currency. This means that the US dollar is used by foreign countries to settle transactions, and it is also used to store wealth, meaning that a lot of the foreign reserves are kept in US dollars. Countries use to settle trade amongst each other, but they don't normally do so in their local currencies. Rather, they both choose to settle in the US dollar. Why? Well, there's a long history behind this, but of course, the US dollar has for a long time been the world's largest economy and has provided the most liquid and deep markets. What does this mean? This also refers to the fact that foreign countries can very easily turn their dollars into treasuries, which will pay them a return. Of course, if as a country you're going to keep parts of your wealth denominated in foreign debt, you want this debt to be of good quality, and for a long time, there has been no better debt than US debt, of course. Now, this can be very much argued today, and we'll definitely make that argument, but we have to understand that the basis for today's monetary system goes all the way back to 1944, when we had the Bretton Woods Accords. Following World War II, it was decided that the whole world would go back to a gold standard. However, the US dollar stood in between other nations' gold and their currencies. Let me explain. While the US dollar was redeemable in gold, other currencies were redeemable in US dollars. That meant that even though foreign countries might have a de facto gold standard, they first had to exchange their currency for dollars, and these dollars could then be exchanged into gold. Of course, this only actually lasted about 25 years. In 1971, Richard Nixon actually closed the gold window, meaning that the US decided to depeg their currency from gold. In other words, no longer would people be able to take their US dollars to the Treasury or the Federal Reserve and ask for gold in return. Now, since then, we've had a world of floating fiat currencies, and even though the US dollar did depreciate during the 70s and 80s, and there was different bouts of inflation, the US dollar remains today the world reserve currency. Most trade is done in dollars, and for a long time, only dollars could be accepted for oil. Having the status of reserve currency has pretty much helped the US implement any type of monetary policy they wanted without much consequence. In other words, the US has been able to print money during times of distress like 2008 and more recently 2020, and we don't actually see the US dollar depreciate. Why? Because countries still need the US dollar. They prefer to hold US dollars. A lot of foreign citizens also choose to keep US dollars, for example, in Argentina and many African countries, if they had access to dollars, which most don't. So the US is still probably one of the best currencies, but for a long time now, its status as global reserve currency has been questioned and challenged. But going back to what Putin said, what does it mean when he says that the US has weaponized the US dollar? Economic sanctions are one of the US's favorite tools when it deals with foreign governments and it doesn't like what they're doing. Of course, this has happened, for example, in Iran, and it happened, of course, most recently to Russia. Now, of course, after Russia invaded Ukraine, they were completely cut off from the dollar system. That means they no longer had access to any dollars, and they had to begin to settle their transactions in rubles, their local currency. Now, first of all, note a couple of interesting things. Even though the ruble did experience some volatility just after the Ukraine conflict, we did see it actually stabilize, and it has actually been really stable in terms of gold over the past 6 months. Now, of course, Russia has been preparing for a long time to detach from the dollar, and as such has been building strong reserves and also perhaps bilateral trade agreements with other nations. A great example of this is, of course, China. In the interview, Putin points out that before the US imposed sanctions on Russia because of the Ukraine war, most of the trade was settled in dollars. Now, in Russia, about 50% of their trade is settled in renminbi and the other 50% in rubles. Now, if we look at this chart, we can see that the US dollar still holds a very important place in global trade. It represents about 88.4% of FX transaction volume. Of course, the US commands about 25.4% of the GDP, and it makes up about 59% of FX reserves. Now, again, the US is still by far the most used currency out there. Go ahead and look at this chart. As we can see, the US dollar share of global reserve currencies has been falling steadily since 2014. From around the top of 66%, it has now fallen to below 60%. This kind of fall of grace in the US dollar can be understood from a couple of points. As Putin points out, the US dollar has been used as a foreign policy weapon. That means that a lot of countries are becoming a lot less comfortable with holding dollars. On the other hand, we've also seen that the Federal Reserve has had no issue with basically printing more dollars and basically lowering interest rates and arguably devaluing the value of the dollar in recent years. This has led a lot of countries like China, for example, to question their use of the dollar, both in transactions and as a form of reserve currency. As we can see, for example, countries like Japan and China have very much reduced their holdings of US treasuries. In other words, they no longer want to hold US debt. Now, they may still need dollars to carry out transactions, but obviously they don't want to hold dollars anymore. Instead, we've seen China, for example, accumulate large amounts of gold and even oil. But if the US dollar is not going to be the global reserve currency, who will take that place? Of course, despite the fact that the ruble has had some success in maintaining its value after the Ukraine sanctions, no one is lining up to use rubles in trade. However, there is one competitor that Putin points out is the real threat to the US dollar hegemony, and that is, of course, China and its renminbi. As we can see in this chart, cross-border yuan use has grown for 5 straight years. The yuan is, of course, the renminbi. We can also see 5 straight years of annual growth in the renminbi growth index, which measures the strength of the renminbi. Not only have we seen Russia begin to use the renminbi a lot more, but a lot of countries in Southeast Asia and even Saudi countries. Quite notably, a lot of these countries are now actually selling their oil to China directly in yuan. In a very interesting bit of recent news, back in November 20th, China and Saudi Arabia signed a currency swap agreement. The People's Bank of China and the Saudi Central Bank signed a local currency swap agreement worth 50 billion yuan, about $6.93 billion. Now, establishing this bilateral trade agreement is clearly an attack on the US dollar. Rather than settle their transactions in US dollars, they are instead choosing to use their own currencies. And to top things off, we of course know that there's an even bigger move to attack the US dollar. And that is of course the BRICS gold-backed currency. Back in August at the BRICS summit, it was announced that these countries were working on a gold-backed currency. Basically, there's an idea that the BRICS countries could join forces and issue a gold-backed currency. Now, of course, a gold-backed currency would pose a big threat to the US dollar. Of course, even today, with China becoming the largest economy by purchasing power parity, no one is lining up either to use the renminbi or currency or the Brazilian real or any of the currencies in the BRICS either. There's still a lot of instability related, and the point is that no one really wants to trust another country. However, gold can be used as an arbitrary third party, let's say, to basically guarantee the value of the currency and the stability of the union. Gold, of course, was at the center of the Bretton Woods system. It was, of course, at the center of the financial system that we had in Europe and the West and even in the East for many, many centuries, and of course worked generally pretty well. In fact, there's a lot of criticisms that can be made to today's regime of fiat currencies. That will be left for another video because it's a whole other topic. Nonetheless, it's important to note 3 things. The use of the US dollar is in decline. This, of course, has strong correlation with the recent rise in geopolitical tensions. Of course, no one wants to be beholden to the US dollar in a world where there's a lot of possibility of further conflicts between the East and the West. Of course, there's the conflict in Ukraine, everything happening in the Middle East, and of course, Taiwan. On the other hand, we can see that the renminbi is starting to pick up as an alternative for the US dollar, especially in southeastern countries, Russia and the Middle East. These countries are beginning to adopt the renminbi, and of course, why wouldn't they? China is, as mentioned before, the largest economy by purchasing power parity. And thirdly, if the renminbi can't succeed by itself, a union of the renminbi with some of the other BRICS currencies and with the backing of gold could totally dethrone the US dollar. The problem that these countries have is that they are still heavily dependent on the US dollar system. Breaking away from the US dollar right now would require a very painful transition. No, that is not generally how China does things. more likely what we will see is a slow decline of the dollar and a very slow increase and adoption of alternative currencies. Now, of course, losing that reserve currency status will only be yet another sign that the US may have already reached its peak as a global superpower. So, to sum up, is Putin right about the US dollar? Putin is right in the fact that the US has lost its way with the US dollar. Everyone relies on the US dollar. The fact that the US is using the US dollar as a weapon and basically using it to its advantage rather than to the advantage of all its users is making a lot of countries wonder whether they'd be better off using something else. However, at the moment, there is no real alternative. No one is lining up to use Chinese yuans or Russian rubles. And even if the BRICS can pull off a gold-backed currency, this will still face a lot of challenges. The BRICS is a group made up of very different geographies, very different economies, and there would still be a lot of kinks to sort out. However, this is certainly something that is going to happen. The question is whether it's going to happen in the next 10, 20, or 200 years. That is also a question for another video. As always, thanks a lot for watching, and if you like this kind of content, go ahead and subscribe, and check out my Substack, jamesford.substack. The link will be below. The Pragmatic Investor. I do a lot more there. I do weekly macro reports on Substack. I do technical analysis and even in-depth stock reports. So go check it out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.